The carriages arrived at Carlton House like lacquered jewels rolling through moonlit fog, each bearing passengers wrapped in perfumes, ambitions, and the silent desperation that accompanied London's grand season. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb sat inside one such carriage, hands folded neatly atop her silk fan, though her heart fluttered with the exhilaration of a young woman who believed society's games were hers to toy with. The night's festivities promised spectacle: new gowns, old rivalries, whispered judgments, and Eleanor, clever and spirited, had long considered these rituals little more than well-dressed theatre. She intended to glide through the evening with the amused detachment of someone untouched by consequence. As her carriage halted, the footman lowered the steps, and Eleanor emerged into the glittering world she loved to mock. Chandeliers blazed through tall windows, scattering gold over polished marble, while a symphony swelled from within, its waltz echoing across the courtyard like an overture to indulgence. Eleanor made her entrance with an unhurried grace, acknowledging the familiar nods of acquaintances, the curious glances, the sly smiles of those who enjoyed her witticisms. She was a viscount's daughter, well-bred, well-liked, and not so wealthy as to threaten, nor so plain as to pity. She existed comfortably in the soft middle ground of attention. Within the ballroom, she found her usual cluster of friends near a column draped in ivy and candlelight. They welcomed her with the sort of warm amusement that accompanied her presence everywhere. Eleanor, with her expressive eyes and a mind sharper than débutantes were encouraged to display, leaned closer as they spoke of the evening's most notable guest, Alexander Hawthorne, the Duke of Ravensshire. His reputation, they said, remained as dark as the velvet coats he favored, cold, calculating, and unyielding. Some called him cruel, though none could agree on the shape that cruelty took. His influence within the Prince Regent's inner circle only deepened the aura of untouchable authority surrounding him. Eleanor listened, intrigued but unimpressed. "A man like him," she murmured, twirling her fan lazily, "wouldn't notice a woman unless she were carrying a map of Europe across her bodice, begging to be negotiated." Her friends stifled laughter, scandalized and delighted by her irreverence. To Eleanor, the remark seemed harmless, a bit of levity in a world that insisted upon gravity. She did not see the shadow that shifted near the edge of the column, nor the figure who paused a moment longer than courtesy required. The words meant for amusement drifted farther than she intended. The ballroom doors suddenly opened wider, and the Duke of Ravensshire entered with the composed confidence of a man accustomed to dominance. His presence altered the atmosphere instantly. Conversations faltered, fans fluttered faster, and even the orchestra seemed to play with greater caution. He acknowledged the Prince Regent with a solemn nod before his gaze traveled, slowly, deliberately, across the crowd. When his eyes met Eleanor's, she felt a brief, inexplicable shiver, though she lifted her chin with determined poise. If he had overheard her jest, surely he would dismiss it as beneath his notice. Men like him rarely stooped to confront anybody who offered nothing of political value. Yet the Duke moved toward her, each step measured, each glance from the onlookers sharpening into a blade of anticipation. Eleanor's friend stiffened, uncertain whether to retreat or shield her. Before she could gather her thoughts, Alexander Hawthorne stood before her in all his imposing authority, his expression unreadable beneath the ballroom's golden glow. The music softened, as if the orchestra itself sensed the shift in narrative. Eleanor's smile faltered, just slightly, but she maintained the dignity expected of her rank. "Lady Eleanor Whitcomb," he said, his voice low enough to feel intimate yet clear enough for a sizable portion of the ballroom to hear. "I find myself compelled to address a matter you unknowingly initiated." His words struck her like a cold draught across bare skin. She sensed danger yet could not discern its shape. Before she could reply, the Duke turned toward the Prince Regent and raised his voice with formal clarity that commanded the room. "If the lady dares one waltz with me, she dares also its consequence. She will be my wife." A wave of gasps cascaded across the ballroom like shattered glass. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the enormity of his declaration settled upon her. In this world, where reputation governed every future, a public vow held a power nearly sacred. To refuse him would be to brand herself arrogant, manipulative, or foolish, an unforgivable breach of propriety. Yet to accept meant stepping into a promise forged with no consent, no affection, and no explanation. Her heart hammered violently beneath her stays, but she forced herself to speak, though her voice emerged scarcely louder than a whisper. "Your Grace, this cannot be." But the orchestra, instructed by an unseen signal, began the next waltz with impeccable timing. Couples parted to form a path between them, their expressions alight with fascination and hunger for scandal. Society craved stories more than justice, and Eleanor realized she had become the night's most compelling tale. The Duke extended his hand, his eyes never leaving hers, as if challenging her to defy him in front of the kingdom's watching gaze. Every instinct urged her to step back, but she understood too well the consequences of retreat. Her family's standing, her mother's fragile social hopes, her own future, all hung upon the next breath she took. She placed her hand in his, though her fingers trembled. The Duke's touch was steady, firm, almost frightening in its certainty. As he led her onto the floor, Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against her skin, each witnessing the moment that would define her reputation. The waltz began. His arm encircled her waist with proper restraint, yet she sensed the power beneath his composure. Their steps aligned effortlessly, as if their bodies understood each other despite their minds remaining at war. Eleanor dared to search his expression for malice, humor, or intent, but she found only a reserved solemnity that revealed nothing. When he finally leaned close, his breath brushed her cheek with unsettling warmth. "You should never have tempted a man who keeps his promises," he murmured. "Even the cruel ones." Her pulse stuttered, but she refused to avert her gaze. If she was to be thrust into this story against her will, she would at least meet it with dignity. The dance ended to a swell of applause that struck her like a verdict. As the Duke released her, he bowed with impeccable form, sealing the unspoken engagement. Eleanor curtsied, her legs barely steady, and realized the crowd was already whispering their future. And in that moment, as the music faded and the Duke walked away with the quiet confidence of a man who had set a trap perfectly, Eleanor understood that her life had just been claimed, not by affection, but by a vow made before a kingdom. Yet beneath the humiliation flickered a pulse of determination. If he believed he could dictate her future so easily, he had gravely underestimated her spirit. London awakened the following morning, as though the city itself had been waiting for scandal to rouse it from slumber. By noon, Eleanor's name fluttered through drawing rooms and tea parlors like a leaf tossed about in a restless wind. Some whispered that she had entrapped the Duke with calculated charm. Others insisted the Duke had acted out of ruthless caprice. Yet none could deny that a public vow made before the Prince Regent carried the weight of irrevocable promise. Eleanor remained indoors, pacing the length of her father's library, while her mother fretted over whether to order congratulatory flowers or black crepe. The confusion in the household mirrored the confusion in Eleanor's mind. She did not understand why he had chosen her, nor why he had done so with such cold certainty. Her father attempted a conversation, though his voice trembled with a mixture of pride and apprehension. A duke's interest could elevate the family forever, yet the manner of the declaration unsettled him deeply. He reminded Eleanor how swiftly society could turn against any woman who appeared ungrateful for a nobleman's favor, especially a man as influential as Alexander Hawthorne. Eleanor listened, clasping her gloved hands together until her knuckles whitened. She longed for clarity, for even a sliver of reasoning behind the Duke's actions, but the memory of his voice, low, emotionless, and utterly assured, left her with more questions than comfort. The first gesture arrived by midday, a small wooden chest, polished to a mirror-like gleam and sealed with the Ravensshire crest. A footman delivered it with the solemnity of a royal decree. Eleanor's mother all but swooned, certain it contained jewels announcing an engagement, but when Eleanor opened the chest, she found only a single silk waltz glove embroidered with the Duke's crest in gold. The glove was exquisite, undeniably costly, but strangely intimate. Eleanor held it delicately, sensing immediately that this was no ordinary token. It was too personal, too deliberate, and far too meaningful for a man known for dispassionate transactions. Her mother interpreted it as the beginning of a courtship. Eleanor felt it as a reminder of the trap closing around her. Word of the glove spread as swiftly as the Duke's declaration had. By evening, It was the subject of every conversation at every supper table. Some insisted the glove symbolized ownership, others claimed it was a romantic gesture. Eleanor, uncertain of its true purpose, could feel the walls of expectation tightening around her. She spent the remainder of the day in her chamber, turning the glove in her hands, searching its delicate embroidery for answers it refused to yield. On the third day, a messenger arrived from the Duke, bearing a formal request that Eleanor attend a meeting at the Ravensshire residence under the pretense of discussing court etiquette. Her mother accepted on her behalf before Eleanor could object. By afternoon, she found herself being escorted into the grand library of Ravensshire House, where towering shelves pressed inward like silent spectators. The Duke stood beside a tall window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture a portrait of self-control. He greeted her with a bow that was impeccably correct yet devoid of warmth. Eleanor began at once, unwilling to allow intimidation to dull her resolve. She demanded to know why he had bound her to a vow before she had spoken a single consenting word. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed upon her with unnerving intensity. When he finally answered, his voice held neither apology nor triumph. He merely stated, in a tone stripped of sentiment, that society would have devoured her long before it ever touched him. His declaration, he claimed, protected her reputation from becoming fodder for malicious speculation. "Cruelty," he said, "is nothing more than the armor required of men in my position." Eleanor bristled at the ease with which he excused himself. "Armor is worn by those who fear harm," she said quietly. "Are you afraid, Your Grace?" His gaze flickered, not with anger, but with something she could not name, an emotion he quickly concealed. She pressed further, emboldened by the rare slip in his composure, but before she could complete her thought, the door cracked open and a footman stepped inside to announce that tea had been prepared. The interruption seemed trivial at first, yet the presence of a servant in a private exchange between an unmarried woman and a duke was the seed of immediate gossip. By the time Eleanor returned home, 2 households had already implied that she had lingered too long in a gentleman's study. The rumor spread rapidly, twisting itself into a narrative that painted her as the instigator of the Duke's declaration rather than its victim. A dowager with a fondness for mischief claimed Eleanor had orchestrated the entire spectacle to ensnare Alexander Hawthorne. The accusation traveled like wildfire, igniting further speculation. When Eleanor attended a small gathering the next afternoon, the shift in atmosphere struck her like a blow. Ladies greeted her with brittle smiles, their daughters avoided meeting her eyes, a cluster of matrons whispered behind lace fans before turning away. Shame prickled across Eleanor's skin, sharp and relentless. She excused herself as politely as she could, fleeing into the drizzling dusk outside. Rain clung to her lashes as she walked toward her waiting carriage, her composure unraveling with each step. London's elegant facades blurred into gray streaks through her tears. She had entered the season believing herself too clever to be wounded by society's games, yet now she found herself both pawn and spectacle. That night, as the storm gathered strength and lightning traced jagged lines across the sky, Eleanor heard the rumble of wheels approaching the Whitcomb residence. A carriage bearing the Ravensshire crest pulled to a halt before the door. Her heart lurched painfully. She expected another demand, another decree, another gesture that complicated her life further. But when the Duke stepped inside, rain dripping from his cloak, his expression was harsher than she had ever seen it. He informed her father that the rumors had reached him and that they threatened to compromise not only Eleanor's reputation but his own. He insisted Eleanor accompany him on a private drive to discuss matters further. Eleanor hesitated, torn between defiance and a desperate desire for clarity, but the intensity in the Duke's gaze left her with little room to refuse. She donned her cloak and followed him through the threshold, stepping into the storm's roar. The moment she settled into the warm glow of the carriage's interior, a tense silence filled the space between them. Lightning flashed behind the steamed windows, illuminating the Duke's unreadable face. As the horses surged forward into the stormy night, Eleanor felt the world she knew receding behind her, replaced by one shaped entirely by the man seated across from her, a man who had appended her life with a single, irrevocable waltz. The carriage lurched forward through the storm, its wheels slicing through puddles that shimmered beneath flashes of lightning. Eleanor felt every jolt, though she kept her back straight, refusing to allow the Duke to see how deeply the evening's turmoil had unsettled her. Alexander Hawthorne sat opposite her, his cloak discarded and rain-dark hair falling slightly out of place, a rare imperfection that made him appear almost human rather than the cold monument society believed him to be. He studied her with that same unwavering intensity that had followed her since the night of the fateful waltz. Yet tonight, something in his gaze seemed strained, as though he struggled against an emotion he refused to name. At last, he spoke, his voice quiet yet firm, barely louder than the rain drumming the carriage roof. He told her the rumors had spread beyond salons and supper tables. Even men in Parliament debated the circumstances of his declaration. He insisted that falsehoods had taken root, claims that she had manipulated him into a public vow. Eleanor's pulse quickened with indignation. She reminded him that she had never sought his attention, and certainly never desired to be trapped in a spectacle that placed her under relentless scrutiny. Her words trembled with restrained fury, but she kept her tone measured, refusing to surrender her composure. The Duke listened without interruption. His restraint, though polite, grated against her anger. She demanded to know why he had not stepped forward to correct the narrative. Why he had allowed days of whispered humiliation to erode her dignity while he remained silent. Her voice lifted slightly, the closest she had ever come to shouting at a man of his rank. Alexander's jaw tightened, his features shadowed by the flickering lantern. He admitted that he had considered issuing a public statement but feared it would only intensify the scandal and bind her reputation even more tightly to his. The more he tried to explain, the clearer it became that he, too, felt trapped, though trapped by expectations rather than choice. Eleanor pressed further, unable to contain her frustration. She wanted truth, not diplomacy, sincerity, not strategy. "You speak of duty as though you have no heart at all," she said, her voice soft but cut with meaning. Something flickered across his face then, a fracture in the mask he so diligently wore. He leaned forward slightly, allowing the lantern's glow to cast warmth across his austere features. "Do you believe I am incapable of feeling?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, uncertain whether this was a trap or a doorway. Before she could answer, he inhaled deeply, as though preparing to reveal something long buried. What he confessed next dissolved the remaining space between them. He spoke of a vow he had made years earlier, one spoken at the bedside of a dying mother whose grasp on his hand had been the only warmth he felt that winter. She had feared that his heart would calcify beneath the weight of his inheritance, that he would one day wed out of strategic convenience rather than human attachment. She made him promise he would choose a woman capable of challenging him, a woman who would not cower before his title, a woman whose spirit could withstand the harsh glare of society and still remain unbroken. Alexander paused, his voice thickening with a vulnerability he could no longer conceal. "When you mocked me so boldly," he said, "you awakened something I had long believed lost." Eleanor felt her breath catch. The confession unsettled her, not because it frightened her, but because it revealed a truth far more complex than she had imagined. Yet confusion persisted. A vow made out of love for a mother did not justify binding a stranger to a future she had not chosen. She challenged him once more, insisting that no promise, however heartfelt, entitled him to commandeer her life. He accepted her rebuke with surprising humility, admitting that he had acted with too much certainty, too much pride, and not enough consideration for her autonomy. His apology, though understated, carried the weight of a man unaccustomed to admitting fault. Their carriage slowed as they approached the steps of Carlton House, the very place where their entanglement had begun. When he offered his hand to help her descend, Eleanor hesitated. The night's revelations had left her suspended between resentment and reluctant understanding. Still, she placed her hand in his, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement that the moment demanded courage. The Duke led her inside, where the deserted ballroom waited in silent grandeur. Chandeliers shimmered like constellations frozen in gold, and the polished floor reflected their faint, trembling reflections. He guided her to the center of the empty room and stood before her, no longer the impenetrable figure who had declared ownership over her fate, but a man stripped of certainty. He told her that he had brought her here because he owed her a choice, the one he deprived her of during their first waltz. His voice softened as he spoke, carrying an uncharacteristic sincerity that wrapped itself around her heart with dangerous warmth. "If you wish to walk away," he said, "I will bear the consequences. I will shoulder the ruin alone. But if you agree to waltz with me by your own will, then whatever future follows will belong to us both." Eleanor felt her breath unsteady. His words held no coercion, only the quiet ache of a man offering what he had never offered anyone, the freedom to refuse him. She glanced toward the glove she still carried, its embroidered crest glinting faintly in the candlelight. For days, she had viewed it as a symbol of imposition, yet now, in the calm of this vast and echoing room, she perceived something deeper. Perhaps the glove had been his first attempt at reaching toward her with something personal, something of himself, however misguided the gesture had been. She stepped closer. The Duke's shoulders tensed, though he did not move. Eleanor lifted her gaze to meet his, and in that charged silence, she understood that accepting him did not mean surrendering herself. It meant acknowledging that beneath his rigid armor lay a loneliness as profound as her own confusion. She spoke his name softly, not as a title but as a man, and told him she would waltz with him, not because society expected it, but because she wished to see who he might become when stripped of fear and duty. Relief washed across his features with a quiet, reverent intensity. He offered his hand again, and this time, she placed hers into it with steady confidence. The orchestra was absent, yet he began to guide her through the opening steps of a waltz, humming the faintest hint of a melody. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and intimate, a far cry from the rigid dance that had sealed her fate days earlier. Now they moved as two individuals tentatively navigating the space between them, seeking harmony rather than dominance. As they turned beneath the chandeliers, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom within her chest, hope, fragile but unmistakable. The Duke's eyes softened as he watched her, no longer cold, no longer calculating, but filled with a cautious longing he could not conceal. When the dance reached its gentle end, he lowered his forehead to hers, his breath unsteady, and whispered that whatever path she chose next, he would honor it. The final flicker of candlelight reflected in their joined hands, and Eleanor realized that, for the first time since the scandal began, she no longer felt controlled by the events around her. She felt a measure of power restored, not granted by him, but reclaimed by her own decision. The night had not resolved all questions, nor healed all wounds, but it had shifted something irrevocably between them. And though she did not yet name it, something in her heart whispered that the next step, whatever it might be, would change them both forever.